uh, when we have a better idea about what we're dealing with, then we can create better ideas for moving forward. Like what kind of things we're going to implement. But first, we have an idea of what's going on. So, a lot of us who work in the professional healthcare space realize that assessments are really important to do before we, otherwise we're just shotgunning things. So let's have just a brief conversation here around stress and measuring stress in our employees, and then we're gonna share some ideas about how we're doing this in our own organizations. What do we think is important? What would our first steps be? We can do a little bit of troubleshooting. And hear from each other a little bit more. So let's talk about the prevalence first of stress. So a very recent Harvard Business Review study, this is within the last month, done of, I don't remember how many people were in the group, but it was in the tens of thousands of people that were surveyed. Now, 89% of people working right now, 89% of people say their work lives are getting worse. Okay, so for those of you who have organizations and people working in them, like, if you have 40 people in your organization, quick, do the math. That's over 30 of those people are likely to say that their work lives are getting worse. 85% of people are reporting that their well-being has declined over the last few months. A global leadership forecast is reporting that 86% of employees feel used up at the end of the day, and that 44% of leaders are considering leaving the company that they're working for right now. So because of stress, because of burnout, because of these issues, and a Gallup poll suggesting that 76% of employees experience burnout at work. So these are big, big numbers. And I just want to kind of present this as this is a real thing. People are really saying this. If we're feeling it in ourselves and organizations, other organizations are feeling it too. So this is something that is definitely really happening. I just wanted to pull this out. I know, Dina was at an ERT we did a couple of months ago, and I shared this statistic, but I had to bring it back up again because I thought it was so important to really take a look at. That not only are 75% or 76% of workers experience burnout, which we saw in that Gallup poll, it's this lower snippet that really caught my attention. That people are likely confused about who to approach with pending or existing burnout. Should they speak with their team leaders, their bosses, or their human resources department? And this was the part that got me. Unfortunately, only 21% of people said that they were able to have open, productive conversations with their HR department and ask for solutions for their burnout. And 56% said that HR departments did not encourage discussions on burnout. So if you look at these two slides, this one saying 90% of people between 75 and 90% of people on all the stats we're looking at are saying that this is a problem. We're burned out. We're stressed. We don't know how much more we can take. And at the same time, they're saying, but you know what? Almost nobody wants to hear us talk about it. This is actually the problem. It's a big enough problem that 75 to 90% of people are really feeling the strain right now. But really what compounds it is that the support isn't there. It doesn't seem to be there. And even if it is there, I don't know if it is or it isn't, but it's not perceived as being there. And those could be two problems within and of themselves, but I just want to kind of get this out, get this fleshed out for a moment. Make this part of our conversation after our talk here, or after this little presentation here, because this is a really important thing. What can we do about this? Okay, so just really quickly on burnout. And this is from 2019, by the way, from a Forbes thing. So we know that it's compounded now. So this is a little bit dated in this particular information, that burnout costs between $125 and $190 billion a year. That workplace stress accounts for 8% of the national spending of healthcare on average. That burned out employees cost their employers 35 to 34% of their annual salary. And that it's also responsible for a significant amount of turnover. And I'm guessing this isn't a surprise to people, right? This is a costly problem for organizations, and it's obviously a costly problem for people who are experiencing stress and burnout. Now, on one hand, stress is simple. So this is the when you look at experts' definition of what stress is, like this is the scientific expert definition of stress. It's pretty simple. Stress is the result of a person's perceived physiological and psychological inability to cope with their current view of reality. Now, we can really chunk that down and say, okay, so stress is a response, right? So stress is something that happens when a person has a perception, whether it's whatever real is, right? Whether it's real or not, who even knows what real is, but the person is perceiving that physiologically they can't meet the demand and psychologically they can't meet the demand. So if physiologically they're perceiving I can't do this and psychologically I can't do this, then their body has to do something in order to help them do it. And so that's really kind of like a really simple idea of what stress is. So stress is pretty simple, but on the other hand, stress is pretty complex. Stress is physiological. We know that when we experience stress, that we have changes in our body. Our muscle tone rises, our breathing gets shallow, our blood pressure goes up, blood lactate increases, our frontal lobes go offline. We become more driven from our behavioral avoidance responses in our musculature, in our in our pleasure to pain reflex systems, right? So we have physiological things happen. Our sensitivity to pain goes up, and then there's psychological things also. I just kind of mentioned them a little bit. How our brain function changes dramatically when we're experiencing stress. Our creative brain centers shut down, and our reactive brain centers become more prevalent. Because if you're thinking about it, if you're walking through the woods and an ancient saber-toothed tiger, I know a lot of people use that as example, but it's a good one. A saber-toothed tiger jumps out of the jungle, right? We don't have to kind of think about like playing cards with it or how am I going to fool this tiger? It's like I'm looking for the nearest hole to jump into. So I'm scanning for I get tunnel vision. People get tunnel vision, and they're looking for things basically just to dive into. We know that when we experience stress, our peripheral vision goes from 180 degrees to about 35 degrees. Literally, tunnel vision happens. So I like to also just note, if you think about driving, if you're driving and if you've ever been driving and been stressed, and then all of a sudden a car comes out of nowhere, and you're like, oh my God, where did they come from? They might have been in your blind spot the whole time, but you literally have a blind spot physiologically when we experience stress. So physiological, and then there's psychological changes also that are associated with stress. They're emotional, right? Stress is emotional as well. We can deal with either emotional shutdown, where we completely go numb, and where we're no longer in tune with anything around us and there's no more sense of empathy for what's going on, or we become very emotionally labile, where we have extreme emotions that we experience when we're having stress. So we can go in either one of those poles, or we can vacillate between the two also. So stress is emotional. Stress is behavioral. I just was doing a coaching session with somebody yesterday, a very successful, proficient executive yesterday. And we were talking about what she would like to work on. And she says, I'm having some avoidance issues with getting some things done. And she said, I primarily eat. I have avoidance phenomenon and I'm eating. So that's a behavioral thing that happens when she's experiencing stress, right? We also know there's other things. There could be smoking, there could be drinking, there also could be exercising too, right? I mean, there could be good coping habits that actually become maladaptive. So the more we're stressed out, I'm just going to go out for that run again. And pretty soon we're just out running or walking all of the time. And it ends up being an avoidance situation. So stress is behavioral. These are just simple examples. And I'm looking forward to having our discussion so we can kind of, what are other things that you're noticing in each one of these areas? Stress is environmental. What's going on around us? What are our office situations like? What are our home circumstances like? What are the people that we're living with? How is that interacting with our perceived ability to either physiologically or psychologically cope with what's going on? So stress, there are environmental factors that are associated with stress. There are social factors. I mean, think about certainly down here in the States, all of last year, running through and beyond the election period has been socially incredibly stressful for so many people. And we're looking, Brian is an expert in this in terms of DEI, and talk about the social factors that generate stressful responses in our systems. Perceptual. So perceptual is part of the definition of stress. So a person can perceive threat, can perceive that I can't cope with something. From the outside, someone seeing someone else have a stress response might look around and go, what are you so stressed about? I don't see what's the deal? This isn't a big deal. But the person perceiving the inability to cope is having a physiological and psychological response based on their perception. So stress is ultimately perceptual, and it's also relational. And it could be a lot more things than this too, by the way. I'll share with you a resource in a little bit of different of a website that categorizes stress assessments. And I lost count how many there are on there, right? There's 30 something categories alone. And then within each category, there's multiple assessments. So there's like literally hundreds of different stress assessments that can be done. We're hoping to narrow it down a little bit today in terms of best practices and helping you do that. But I just want to let you know that stress is simple, but stress is also complex. And our relationships, how do those interact with our perceived inabilities or abilities to cope or to not cope, right? So we have a big bundle of things that are rolled together that we're calling stress. So stress is both simple and stress is also very complex. Stress is strange. Not everyone responds to the same stressful exposures in the same ways. So we can have two people that are in the same automobile accident, and they will respond to it very differently. We have two people that are in the same office working. Something happens in the office. They'll both respond to that very differently. At the same time, stress is predictable. So there's been some research on stress that two of the prime theories on workplace stress are that when we have what we call high effort and low reward. So this is one validated workplace measure that's been done, what we call the job content questionnaire. It's one of the resources that some organizations use. And what they ask is, how much effort do people feel like they're giving in proportion to the amount of reward that they're receiving? So when you have high effort and low reward, that is a marker for increased stress for employees. The other combination of that is high demand, low control. So what high demand, low control is that you have very high responsibilities, but very low control, very low input into what those responsibilities actually are. And when you combine these two things together, high effort, low reward, and high demand, low control, what we see in workplaces is 3 times as many heart problems, 3 times as much back pain, 5 times certain cancers, 2 to 3 times as many conflicts, increased mental health problems, infections, injuries, and substance abuse issues. So we know that as strange as stress is, there are also some predictabilities around it. And it's this high effort, low reward, high demand, low control that tend to be some of the measured predictabilities when we talk about stress in the workplace. Okay, so when we think about measuring stress, so now we have an idea of maybe what's going on in some workplaces. This is, of course, isn't all of the answers, but this is just kind of a setting a framework for us to be able to have a discussion. If we want to measure stress in an organization, we need to ask ourselves some questions. First of all, why are we measuring? Kind of like, what's the point? Why are we doing this? What relevant information are we hoping to glean from it? And I'd love to know some of your answers to these questions if you are thinking about in your own organizations or going into organizations measuring stress. Like, what's the point? What information are people hoping to glean from it? And another question is, how simple to comprehensive makes sense? So very simple assessments can give us very rapid feedback, but the information might not be as accurate or as comprehensive as if we do a deeper dive assessment where we can get more information from it. And these are questions are all just based on people's availability, employee time schedules, funding, energy levels, right? So there's a lot of things that go into these questions of why we want to do it a certain way we want to do it. And I don't think there's any one perfect thing for everybody, but these are the questions that we want to answer. Why are we measuring to begin with? What's the relevance that we're hoping to glean? What information are we really looking for? How simple to comprehensive makes sense? How important is it that it's validated? Now, so a validated assessment's gone through some rigorous testing so that a couple things can happen. When people answer it, that their accuracy is more predictable or likely based on the way they're testing it. It also tends to be validated for a certain period of time. So certain measures say these will be valid for 4 weeks or 8 weeks or 12 months or whatever it is based on the test. And also they can be validated to be transferable to other ideas or other thoughts, like the perceived stress scale, for instance, which is one we love to use because it's very simple, but it is validated. It can also be validated to people's health measures. So we're measuring their level of stress, but also from the PSS, we can also actually make determinations on how healthy people are or how much health care they're going to require when you're looking at those types of things. All right, and then what do you intend to do with the results after you get it? So these are the questions you want to ask if you're thinking about measuring stress in your organization. You want to know some of these basic ideas. And again, this isn't an extensive or exclusive list. I'm sure there's other questions on here, but these are some starting points. Okay, let's look at a couple of ways to measure stress. So the first way, like the really simple way to measure stress, are what we call non-validated scale surveys. So think about a 0 to 10 survey. So a really simple example of a non-validated scale survey would be to send out one question to all of your employees and say, on a scale of 0 to 10, how stressed are you right now? So you'll get information, but it's not necessarily validated, but you'll get information. So, and that might be all you're looking for is, hey, on a global scale today, like how stressed are my people? Send out a scale and get a report back, depending on what you want to do with it or not. Does that meet your goals? Or you can have multiple question surveys from 0 to 10 questions, something like that. But doing that 0 to 10 scale, these are very simple to create. They're very user-friendly to fill out and for people to receive. And you can make the questions, create the questions based specifically on the information you're looking to glean. Right, so if you want to know specifically how stressed people are that are working on the night shift, for instance, then you can get your questions based specifically on that. If you want to know based on specifically on people's travel time into work, then you can ask questions specifically on that. If it's around a DEI issue, you can ask specifically questions on that. So you can make up your own surveys and get some answers. And we help people create the surveys so that they can get the answers that they want to get. You can do stakeholder interviews. So the stakeholder interviews, either you can do that as an internal function from a management or a leadership perspective, or you can have someone from the outside come in and do stakeholder interviews with a scripted set of questions in order to better understand the thought processes of the people that are working within your organization. So the non-validated survey couldn't be anonymous, or it can be named, either one. The stakeholder interviews can be reported as anonymous if you have someone from the outside bring that information in. And the stakeholder interviews, you get more nuances, obviously, than you do if you're just asking simple survey questions, right? So there's huge value in doing stakeholder interviews for that reason. Now, you might not get metrics so much unless you're matching them with another scale, but you'll get deep information based on what people are experiencing and nuanced answers around it. And if the stakeholder interviews, typically the way we do them is we have rote questions that have already been decided ahead of time. And then after we do the interviews, we take those answers and we put them into a big spreadsheet. So we start to kind of look at commonalities of responses from people. And then you can start to pull out threads and themes of what's causing the stress. They feel like there's response to it. And we can create the questions based on what people are specifically looking to get out of doing this exercise with their folks. Okay, a validated measure is the job content questionnaire. So this is the one that assesses the not the high demand, low control. The high effort, low reward is the job content questionnaire, and the effort reward is actually that's the high effort, low reward. The other one is the low control one. So these are both validated measures. Just full transparency, I haven't used these measures before because there's a certification process that's utilized to go through these measures and to validate them. So I haven't used those two, but they're available to people. And I'll show you a resource. We can go find out more information about that if you're interested. We love using the perceived stress scale. It's a validated measure. It's an open measure. So we've created a tool through SurveyMonkey where it auto scores it and feeds the information right back out, because there's a scoring process that has to happen with it. So whether you're hand scoring it or auto scoring it, we've created an auto scoring methodology that we do with all of our clients to get information on the perceived stress scale. The reason we really like it is because it's validated, it's transferable to other measures of mental wellness, to physical wellness, to healthcare utilization. And the perceived stress scale, it takes about 4 minutes to fill out. So it doesn't take much of people's time at all, between 3 and 4 minutes to fill out. So we like that also. And it's validated for between 4 and 8 weeks. So it doesn't have a long stretch of time, but to fill it out again and again, it's only a 4-minute exercise to do it. And then you get it auto-populated and you can get an idea of where people's score comes in terms of how stressed they are. And then another one of the favorite tools that Ani and I use in our organization is motivational mapping. So I know that a couple of folks have been mapped on our call here today, so you can speak to that if you like to. But from the motivational mapping perspective, a very comprehensive assessment. It only takes about 15 minutes to do online, but we get a lot of information from it. And some of the information we get from it is not only how motivated people are, and when we look at those motivational scores, we can start to determine what people's stress behaviors are within those scores. We can also determine what specifically is most likely stressful for people based on their motivational profiles. So it's a bit more comprehensive, and we follow that up typically with organizational debriefs and leadership debriefs that people can understand their folks a little bit better within the organization. So these are some ways to measure stress within an organization. So here's a couple of resources, and we'll send you a copy of the PDF so that you can access these things. But one of the resources is the best practices for stress measurement and how to measure psychological stress in health research. And then another resource is the stressmeasurement.org. And so that's a great link, and it's got a toolbox section where it's just got like tons and tons of different assessment links on there. Again, some of them are open access. Other of those links are you have to be certified and validated to be able to use them. But it's a wealth of resource to be able to be accessed for folks. All right, and then there's our contact information, which we'll include at the end of our PowerPoint, and we'll give you a copy of that in PDF form.